Okay, so thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Amanda Brock, and I'm going to chair the next half-hour panel today. Thank you very much to the team from OpenInfra Nordics for inviting us along. And I think this is a first for you guys, because this afternoon we're going to spend half an hour talking about risk and compliance in open source. So as I said to you, I'm Amanda Brock. I don't think I've met many people in the room before. I've worked in and around open source for about 12 years now. I joined Canonical in early 2008, worked on Ubuntu for 5 years, and I ran the legal team at Ubuntu, Canonical. Since then, I've worked in a variety of roles. I've worked with the Open Invention Network, the world's biggest defensive IP organization, which is a patent organization, where we have a defensive patent pool protecting open source. A bunch of other organizations, including the United Nations Technology and Innovation Labs. I'm the chair of their Open Source and IP Committee. And I'm the CEO of a software project called Trustable, which is about making software trustable. And the way we have looked at that project, for the first 3 or 4 years, it was purely an engineering project. And in the last year, since I got involved, we've broadened that out to cover legal and compliance. And the idea is that we will bring good engineering practices, legal and compliance together to demonstrate what makes open source software, where we have transparency in our processes and our practices, trustable for everyone to use. So I'm going to start by introducing the panel to you this afternoon. We have, first of all, Bjorn Lundell, Professor Lundell, who is a professor at a university I cannot pronounce in Sweden. If I try, I sound like the Swedish chef. So Bjorn is from a university between the 2 biggest lakes in Sweden.
Yes.
Yes? So I can say that. And Bjorn has a PhD from the University of Exeter. He has spent more than 20 years? 30, it gets more, yeah. Doing research around software process, and he's going to talk to you a bit about that this afternoon. Then we have Andrew Katz, who, like myself, is a lawyer. Andrew is based in the UK. He is, however, a coder turned lawyer. And Andrew heads up a law firm called Moorcrofts and has recently, through his compliance work, set up a company called Orcra in the UK as well, which he'll tell you more about. And then finally, Martin von Willebrand, another very established open source lawyer who, like Andrew, works a lot with Open Chain and heads up HH in Finland. So you've got Sweden, the UK, and Finland on the panel. We're going to each, well, I'm not, but the panelists are each going to take about 5 minutes to talk about different compliance topics around open source, which help to make it trustable. Frankly, if I can stay on this stool without falling off it, we'll be doing quite well. And then once they've done that, we're going to open the session up for questions. So we should have 10 to 15 minutes to give you the opportunity to ask questions. And it's fine if you want to take those off topic and move away from what we've been talking about. But we hope that the 3 short presentations would give you some insight into compliance and open source.
Okay. That's yours.
So I have another slide there that I'm not going to go through. I'll go through this at the end if we have time.
Okay.
So click one more.
Okay. So thank you, Amanda. And some of the research challenges that we have looked at for a couple of decades now has been related to helping organizations trying to understand what it's all about to do development of software and procurement of software. We have specifically looked at lock-in effects. And for those of you who are based in Sweden, saw that the Swedish government came out with a new proposal yesterday about that, 2 days ago about that. We have looked at standard lock-in and file format lock-in in a number of studies. We have also investigated use of open file format standards, and we have investigated the extent to which you can actually develop and implement those in open source software projects. So in other words, if you have open file format standards, you can implement and distribute those in open source projects. And these are issues that we have looked at in commissioned research from the Swedish Competition Authority, for example, and also together with companies. We have done a number of studies, some which are published and some which are ongoing, concerning patent holders that are not possible to reach when you try to investigate the conditions for use of certain standards. And that can cause problems if you want to implement something in an open source project. We have also seen that some holders of such patents are actually unwilling to provide patent licenses, despite the fact that they're obliged to by their involvement in various standardization organizations. So basically, quite a lot of the research that we have investigated concerns whether or not an organization that seeks to implement a specific file format standard, can such an organization obtain patent licenses which allow for implementation in open source software projects. And some of you may be aware of the fact that the JRC study is currently ongoing in the European Commission exactly on this topic, and we have been involved as part of that. So happy to talk more about that.
Right, excellent. Thanks, Bjorn, and thanks for the introduction, Amanda. So I've been advising clients on open source software compliance for over 20 years now. And what does that mean? Well, from a purely legal perspective, that means looking primarily making sure that the licenses are compatible, that organizations know the code that they've got, know what licenses are applicable to them, and know that when they are releasing code, they're releasing it in accordance with those licenses. And what tends to trigger the compliance events are typically either because it's an organization that just wants to make sure that it's doing the right thing, but it's also half a night of the particular events that might occur that they're concerned about. This is where the risk aspect comes in. So quite commonly, this is something that happens prior to a company either undergoing some form of funding round, or alternatively, they may be seeking a flotation, or they may be selling out to another organization. And in each case, they'll undergo some form of due diligence, and they know that somebody's going to be crawling all over their code. And when I was looking at this sort of process maybe 20 years ago, that was a fairly straightforward activity, because a typical application would consist of the core code and 5, 10, 20 components maybe, and you could look at the licenses of each of those components, you'd put them onto a spreadsheet, and then you'd figure out whether the compliance had occurred or not. That has become much, much more difficult recently, because the development of tooling and different frameworks that people use now means that a typical application can quite easily consist of 3, 4, 5,000 different components. And trying to manually analyze all of those particular components is something that is just no longer possible. And this is really where tooling comes in, and it's something that Martin's going to be talking about in a second. But from my perspective, when you're looking at the output of these sort of tools that enable you to make sure that you've got compliance, what you rapidly discover as somebody's helping companies to go through this compliance process is that if they have decent practices and procedures in place in the first place, you know that the outputs are going to be a lot better. Mm-hmm. So at the outset, the best thing to do really is to make sure that you've got appropriate practices and procedures in place, and a lot of people have been doing that. But until recently, there was really no unified way to do this. Everyone was doing it in their own way. Mm-hmm. And we naturally stumbled across very similar ways of doing it. So, all organizations, they need to know what their code is. They need to have some sort of process for checking in code. They need to have some sort of process to ensure that they know that the code is subject to a particular license. They need some sort of quality control over the code that they're acquiring, so that they know that they can actually trust where it comes from, and this is one of the aspects of trustable as well. Things that are sort of removed from what I'm doing purely as a lawyer, obviously then it comes into questions of security, etc., but that's also relevant and something that needs to be built into a process. And you need to make sure, like any other process in an organization, that all of the people who are subject to it are aware of it, that they're trained in it, that they know who to go to if there's something wrong, and that there is appropriate management within the organization who is tasked with dealing with it, and so on and so forth. So this is all pretty standard stuff. There's nothing particularly unusual about it, but the problem is that different organizations did this in different ways. And then a few years ago, it was Dave Meyer from Qualcomm who said, well, why can't we come up with some sort of standardized framework so that we know that when we're dealing with organizations who have all done these own things in their own way, we can first of all share knowledge and experience in this area, but the output is that each company is going to be doing things in a similar way. It can be very tailored to their own organization, but the framework is the same. And that really was the genesis of something called OpenChain, which is a project which is administered by the Linux Foundation. And we have been an OpenChain partner for a couple of years now, through both through Moorcrofts, which is the law firm, and Orcro, which is the company that Amanda mentioned earlier. So what we're doing is we're helping organizations of all sizes really to implement their practices and procedures within this particular framework. And it's intended to reduce friction. And the idea is that if you are procuring some software and you're procuring it from an organization which you know is OpenChain compliant, then it's going to be a lot more straightforward because your due diligence processes are going to be a lot simpler. You're going to know that that organization, first of all, has got the processes to get things right in the first place, but secondly, that when you ask for all of the compliance materials, when you know that they're distributing their software, that you have the right copies of the GPL, you have the right notice files required by Apache, you've got the right copyright notices that virtually all open source licenses require, that they are going to be included within the distribution. And when tied in with other Linux Foundation projects like SPDX, for example, which makes sure that each individual component has got a properly allocated license and it's very easy to find what the license text is, then this all comes together really to reduce the friction as much as possible. So essentially, as a lawyer, I'm trying to make myself redundant. I'm trying to make this much more of a process rather than something that looks at the legal text of licenses.
Just before we move on, Andrew, how many people in the room work in legal and compliance? Do any of you? Okay, a couple of you, not many. That's interesting. We actually have a very strong legal community in open source, and it's particularly unusual in that we collaborate and share stuff, which lawyers aren't always that great at doing. So I think when we get to the questions at the end, maybe we'll talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And so, I mean, for example, we've produced quite an extensive open source policy that's designed to work very closely with the way that the OpenChain specification is put together. That's all available for free. It's on the OpenChain website. You can download it and use it. And amend it to your own organization. It works for businesses of all sizes, and I've been working with a wide range of businesses to help them implement OpenChain. We have one very small client called B2M, and they only have about 9 developers, but the process for them was really straightforward because we'd put most of the processes in place anyway, and it really just took a couple of days of concerted effort to get them to a position where they were able to certify. We're also working with much larger organizations. I'm working with one at the moment that sells actually into the legal sector, and they have about 6,000 components, so it's going to be a much longer journey to reach compliance for them. But the sort of organizations that have signed up for this, I mean, locally Scania is a very big supporter of OpenChain, but also there's sort of companies like Toyota, there's quite a lot of Japanese companies as well, NEC, Panasonic, etc. So it's got sort of worldwide reach, but even if you're a small organization, it's relatively easy to sign up to. The plan is it will become an ISO standard in 2020. But anyway, I was talking about tool chains, and I know that's something that Martin is going to be talking about.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Bjorn, and thanks, Amanda, for the introduction. I'm Martti from Willebrand, and Amanda already introduced me. I want to add one thing. I've been working similar to Andrew, but a few years less. Next year I'll have 20 years working in open source compliance, legal stuff. One particular thing was that we set up in 2008 a collaborative effort in Finland under the name Validos Association, where several enterprises shared in a way their open source compliance practices and tooling. But in 2008 that was done based on a pretty manual process. I could repeat the same example that a few components, max 15, 20 components at that time was a large project, or had a lot of open source dependencies. Today, many projects, notably if you go into JavaScript side, you get several thousands of packages. If you take a Linux embedded project, you have 150 packages, but most of those packages, or you could have a smaller one too, but most of those packages consist of several components. So actually you reach the thousands that way too. So really, in any way to actually achieve consistently compliance, you will need automation. We've been in a way doing, as we've recognized this, and together with others we recognize it, we started this year, well actually in the end of last year, we started a double open project where we try to in a way find ways of how to use open tooling and open data to achieve this automated compliance. And in a way the background is that we know, and there exist for compliance automation, there exist proprietary tools. They allow for a little bit different approaches, but they allow for automation in a continuous integration, continuous development tool chain. But they are, what I would say, philosophically weak in the sense that they create silos. They create silos of compliance data. They don't communicate that compliance data back to the open source projects. They don't fit very well to small to medium-sized companies. The pricing is quite high. So, and in the end, I believe also that the quality of compliance doesn't benefit of, in a way, an incremental increase of knowledge in the tradition of open source. So that's why we've learned that many of the companies we work with, or other companies in the ecosystem, really want to invest their time into getting this tool chain part to work with open tools using open data to get the open source compliance also handled with open tools. And in our double open project, where we were investigating different initiatives, if you want to go to doubleopen.org, you see one of our publications is the listing of all open source compliance tooling and initiatives that there are. It's a living publication, but some people have called it the in a way most complete listing there exists on these type of toolings and initiatives. If you are support some tool or project and it doesn't exist there, you can just do a git pull request there to add your tooling and some explanation on that there. But anyhow, when running this and doing the ecosystem surveys, we were finding that the OSS compliance tooling work group, which was partially initiated or mostly initiated around the German automobile and industry manufacturers there, but one of the, in a way, most concretely forwarding this agenda of open compliance tooling, and then during this year it is formed under the open chain tooling work group. On the slides you can see the mailing list, where you can, via the mailing list link, you can get into all the other stuff existing there. So that's a place to in a way, if you want to develop the tooling aspect, that's a place where you can meet others, share on your tooling experience, but also agree or work towards joint approaches in the tooling side. And that's something that we are also, with the Double Open project, we are actively engaged with. And then also on the other side, because for us to succeed here, for us jointly, I don't mean our law firm or us for us an ecosystem, everyone to succeed in this, we would benefit of joint approaches, like what the Open Chain project brings a joint approach to the compliance process quality improvement side. The tooling work group aims to unify not everybody needs to use the same thing, but unify certain key components, make it easy, modular approaches. So in the Double Open project, we are in a way aiming to actually take those open source tools, put those into practice in a proof of concept. We have there a partially government-funded work, and we have some room there, so we aren't selling anything there. So, if you are interested in a way applying these open source tools in your environment, you can get also input and help from the Double Open project. If well, at least if the interests are reasonably aligned there. So that's one way also to look at. So that's. Thank you.
So just coming back to the audience, there's a couple of people who work in compliance and legal. Are most of you from companies that would consider themselves to be open source companies? Do you want to show me? No, interesting. So mostly you consider yourselves to be enterprise commercial organizations who use some open source in your products or your systems. Okay. So do we have any questions at this stage from the floor? Yes. Do you want to identify yourself because they're recording this?
Tony Nicolaides working at Rev-Billing Pro. Yes, the largest open source vendor in the Nordics. So, you mentioned that open source projects may contain 6,000 packages. You mentioned that some open source projects are pretty large with up to 5,000-6,000 packages. How many different open source licenses do those projects contain?
It's a very good question, because your question immediately raises a question, which is what is the definition of open source, and whether you go back to the OSI's definition, and it's straight away you can look at something like Debian, and if you stick to an OSI definition, there are licenses in something like Debian that aren't within the OSI definition. Now that's probably a little bit more technical than some of the audience and not technical enough for others, because I'm told it's a very wide level of experience. How many licenses? So
yes, if I thought about it, I would have actually brought the specific statistics along for the project that I mentioned. So I'm sort of working from recollection here, is that there were probably about 70 or 80 licenses in total, of which about 50 of them were just individual licenses that were sort of strange in some sort of way. But something like 80-90% of the code was covered probably by about 6 licenses.
Yeah, that's about right.
So I think that's sort of, I don't know.
Martin.
Yeah. So to add to that, in a way, if you look at it from a license scanning perspective, you will identify several hundreds of different open source licenses, but in a way the differences tend to become smaller. In a way, then again from the perspective of obligation management, that the different licenses contain a little bit different obligations, and you need to take those into account when in a way producing a compliant end product. I'd say that 20 to 30 licenses contain somewhat significantly different types of obligations or different combinations. But this is a very rough estimate. But like then there's also the difference that you have the OSI definition, which encompasses, I think, far more in a way than 70 licenses, but then you have the list of approved licenses, which is actually about 70 licenses. Yeah. But these aren't the same. They are a little bit different in that sense.
So for me, starting at Canonical, I didn't have to do things like audits because, we had a whole development team that managed everything and knew what they were doing. I would get asked very specific questions about licenses. But then when I left Canonical, I worked for some commercial companies and I did a lot of audits. And as Andrew says, it tended to be that you were auditing around somebody trying to IPO, somebody trying to take investment, or something bad would have happened in an organization information and they'd want to improve going forwards. Generally, it wasn't the latter. Generally, it was the investment in things that triggered it, or they would have a contract that required them to give a warranty or an indemnity about their open source usage. And I think the audit's a difficult thing if you don't know what you're doing. Once you know what you're doing, it's not that difficult, and you find that a lot of it is just going through and saying, yeah, fine, and then you get the list of the things that are awkward or unusual. And what I used to find is that those awkward and unusual things were where you really needed a lawyer who understood the licensing, and often that was because something would come up as a false positive, or it would come up and say it was an open source license and wouldn't be, and you need somebody that really gets it to pick those out. And for me, the common thing was licenses that said they could be used but not for commercial usage. So it was fine when you were just developing something internally or using it in a community way, but then once you started to use it commercially, it was a problem. I hope that answers your question. The licenses tend to be a few that are central.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? You should take advantage of having these people to answer your questions. Can we have the mic down here? Or you can get it yourself. Very egalitarian, these Swedes.
Fatih Değirmenci, Ericsson Software Technology. My question is about the developers and their view of licensing. I work in various Linux Foundation hosted open source projects and contribute to some other open source projects like OpenStack and so on. And as a developer, I feel the developers have lack of understanding when it comes to licensing. What I do generally, like I just copy paste the same heading without looking at the details. Sometimes I wonder what those means and follow the links, look at OSI descriptions, license types, but it's kind of boring for developers, sorry to say.
It's boring for lawyers too, I promise.
So this tooling and stuff, which is good because LF also runs some automatic auditing tools and tells us, okay, you don't have the license header or you are using wrong license, which should be Apache license. My question is more about how to make this information easily consumable by developers.
That's interesting.
Like, I don't think any developer would spend more than 10 minutes reading licensing or compliance stuff.
And some of the licenses don't take that long to read, frankly. That, they're really short, and all you have to do is put a header in with the attributions, whatever it is. But
any activity to increase the awareness,
there has been
educate.
loads, actually, and I should probably give a bit of a plug for 2 or 3 different things here. Yeah. So there's the European Legal Network, which came out of the Free Software Foundation Europe, which has, I think, about 400 members, and it's an open discussion around legal issues. You won't want to join that if you're a developer, you'll be bored rigid. But if you've got a lawyer that's interested, then it's a sort of geeky legal thing to do. There is a journal currently called International Free and Open Source Law Review, a very catchy title, which we set up about 10 years ago that also deals with a lot of these issues. Andrew and I are involved in a 2nd edition of a book on open source law, policy and practice, which will come out in 2020. The 1st edition is good, but it's out of date because the modeling was all about OS and rather than cloud and stuff, so a lot of things have changed. And there's been a lot of case law in between. I'll give those a plug. We have tried numerous times to do things. I was involved in an app at one stage, trying to make license picking and things easier. I'm not sure that there's actually an easy answer to fix it for you, because it's just a matter of doing it and learning it, right?
The holy grail really is to have a plug-in in your browser, so that if you happen to be looking at GitHub and one of the other sites, this browser knows what your company's criteria are, and it basically says, yep, you can use this, or no, you can't use this, and then it gives you reasons why, and then you can go and have a word with your line manager if you think, well, we really need this, can we change the policy? I mean, that's the holy grail, is really to make it as easy as possible for the developer, so that. And this doesn't necessarily, just cover the licensing issues. In the ideal world, it would cover things like, are there too many security vulnerabilities? Yeah. What's the maturity model of the particular project? So it can just score the piece of software against a whole bunch of criteria. And if it's green, fine, just go ahead and use it, no problem. If it's amber, then you need to go and talk to somebody about it and say, yeah, okay, so we've got a bit of a problem with this one, but is it okay in context? And red, it's just no way. So that's sort of the holy grail. And there are various projects that are working towards that, but it's a big ask.
So I'm conscious that we have probably too little time really today to do a very good interactive session. And if you think this is useful, we'd be very happy to talk to you this afternoon. We'll all be around for the rest of the day. I flick back to a slide that's in the pack on trustable. From your perspective, a lot of what would be interesting around trustable is the engineering good practice and the way that it's going to pull together engineering, compliance and legal into one package where you can self-certify that your software is engineered in an appropriate way. And the idea behind that is that we'll then develop something that helps us all with contracts and makes open source more accessible by managing the risk and managing the sort of contract terms that you're being asked to sign up to through insurance products, which currently are very hard to get. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that because I don't think it's appropriate for you today. Andrew, Martin, Bjorn and I have all put some details on there. If you do have questions for any of us, feel free to contact us. We're all happy to come back to you. And I think we're bang on time, so I'm going to leave you with that. Thank you very much.
So much.